In just a moment, Generations with Kevin Swanson. But first, this. The World View in 5 minutes.
It's Wednesday, March 27th, A.D. 2019. This is The World View in 5 minutes, written by yours truly and heard at theworldview.com. I'm Adam McManus. On Saturday, March 23rd, at around 1:50 p.m., more than 20 Chinese police officers raided a Bible school class at Beijing's Shuwang Church, reports International Christian Concern. The authorities demanded that the church cease its activities immediately and read out an official document formally banning the church. All of the students who were in attendance were taken to a nearby school and questioned by authorities. Shuwang Church is one of the largest house churches in Beijing and is attended by more than 1,000 people. It was targeted and heavily persecuted for its refusal to join the state-sanctioned church in 2011. The United Kingdom has denied asylum to an Iranian Christian convert, saying that Christianity is not a quote-unquote peaceful religion, reports the Washington Examiner. According to the UK's Home Office, which oversees immigration and passports, they rejected a man's application for asylum, saying the applicant's claim that Christianity is peaceful is, quote-unquote, inconsistent with the Bible, since Leviticus, Exodus, Matthew, and Revelation are, quote, filled with imagery of revenge, destruction, death, and violence, end quote. The decision by the British Home Office puts the Iranian national's life in grave danger, as apostasy is punishable by death in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Romans 12:8 says, "If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone." According to the Media Research Center, from January 20th, 2017, Inauguration Day, through March 21st, 2019, the last night before Special Counsel Robert Mueller sent his report to the Attorney General, the ABC, CBS, and NBC evening newscasts produced a combined 2,284 minutes of Russian collusion coverage, most of it, 1,900 minutes, following Mueller's appointment on May 17, 2017. That's an average of roughly 3 minutes a night, every night, for an astonishing 791 days, a level of coverage normally associated only with a major war or a presidential election. The Big Three network's TV reporters devoted more time to the Russia investigation than any of the Trump administration policy initiatives on issues like immigration, tax reform, trade, North Korea, ISIS, the economy, veterans affairs, and the opioid epidemic. In other words, since his presidency began, nearly 1/5 of all of Trump's evening news coverage has been about this one investigation. From January 1st through March 21st of this year, the spin of Trump coverage on the evening newscasts has been 92% negative versus just 8% positive, even worse than the 90% negative coverage the Media Research Center calculated in 2017 and 2018. Janique Stewart, a black Christian with the Life Training Institute, was recently disinvited from an on-campus debate at Cornell University due to her biblical beliefs about sexuality, reports CBN News. In a Facebook post on March 23rd, Stewart wrote, quote, "It was explained to me that having someone on campus who believed the way I did was tantamount to allowing a racist to speak who held pro-slavery and pro-Holocaust views. More and more universities are censoring Christian voices in an effort to silence dissent. The First Amendment supports freedom of speech, not freedom from speech. I will not allow my voice to be silenced." End quote. Deuteronomy 5:32-33 says, "So be careful to do what the Lord your God has commanded you. Do not turn aside to the right or to the left. Walk in obedience to all that the Lord your God has commanded you, so that you may live and prosper and prolong your days in the land that you will possess." On Saturday, February 23rd, 4,000 Christians attended a day of mourning held in Albany, New York, organized by Elizabeth Johnston, the activist mommy, in response to New York Democratic Governor Andrew Cuomo's decision to sign an extremist abortion law, which removed protections from babies who survived botched abortions. An additional 40,000 pro-lifers at 20 sites across America watched simultaneously via live stream. Now, Johnston, author of Not on My Watch, is organizing another day of mourning on Saturday, April 6th in Richmond, Virginia, where the Democratic Governor Ralph Northam actually defended infanticide on a WTOP radio broadcast. Best-selling authors, longtime pro-life advocates, and twin brothers David and Jason Benham will be speaking. And finally, Shayla and Thomas Harwell were attending a Brad Paisley concert at the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo last week when she noticed a woman struggling to get to her seat. Since her husband is a firefighter for the Hardin Volunteer Fire Department north of Houston, Texas, Shayla pointed the woman out to Thomas and suggested he lend a hand. Thomas immediately leapt to his feet and helped the woman to her seat. After the show was over, Thomas saw the woman was too tired to get back up the steep stadium steps once more. So he simply scooped her into his arms and carried her the rest of the way, reports Good News Network. Since Shayla posted a photo of her husband's good deed to Facebook, it has been shared thousands of times. People have even offered to give the couple additional concert tickets as a thank you for their kindness. In response to all of the attention, Thomas said, quote, "If you're alive and breathing, you should not need an excuse to help someone else. If they need help, help them," end quote. And that's the World View in 5 minutes on this Wednesday, March 27th in the year of our Lord 2019. Subscribe by iTunes or email to our unique Christian newscast at theworldview.com or get the app through Google Play or the App Store. I'm Adam McManus. Seize the day for Jesus Christ.
Welcome to the Generations broadcast. Kevin Swanson, your host with you today. I'm a homeschool father of 5, raising our kids out here on the eastern plains of Colorado. We've been homeschooling since the early 1990s. My parents started homeschooling us back in the 1960s. Would have been about 1968 in Portland, Oregon, that my mother began to homeschool me. And I'm not sure that we could spell the word back then. I'm not sure the word existed. And I'm not sure that the state approved of what we were doing. We just didn't ask questions. We just began to homeschool. And later, my parents took that out to the mission field and came back several times on furlough and continued to homeschool well into the 1980s. So that's the beginning of the homeschooling movement, at least for Kevin Swanson. And today we're going to talk a little bit about parental freedoms, parental rights. And, of course, this is the gigantic battle that's waging today. The initial battles at the founding of our nation so many years ago had to do with freedom of religion or freedom for churches to operate without extraordinary controls on the part of the civil magistrate. Today, friends, the battle is not so much the control the state has foisted over the church. Today, it is a battle over the freedom of the family, parental rights, in the face of a rising tyranny. And so this is the battle for the present day. This is where the battle rages most ferociously. I can remember a couple of years ago, we were battling over the compulsory attendance law here in the state of Colorado, and the homeschoolers, of course, all showed up. And we pushed pretty hard against the widening or the increased restriction on the compulsory attendance law, forcing our children into school at 6 years of age. And the governor thankfully made an exception for us in the bill. And but at that point, of course, I still stood up and said, we oppose the bill. And the chairperson turned to me and said, "You're a homeschooler. We already made an exemption for you." I said, "I'm here for the rest of Colorado parents." The only drawback was they weren't there. So it was the homeschooling population that was eager to see some level of parental freedom in this state. And friends, this is the battle for the day. This is where we are going to be fighting for every inch we can get for parental freedoms in a day of massive statism. In fact, I was in a Worldview conference just last week in the Bahamas, and a speaker asked the audience of 250 Christian pastors and parents a simple question. If you had a choice between sending your children into a transgender homosexuality training class or losing your children to a government social services department, what would you do? Which would you choose? Send your children into the public school transgender indoctrination class or lose your kids? Which would you choose? And my answer was, I'd move to the Bahamas. But what if that option was not available to you? What if you didn't have an extra $250,000 laying around to make a major move like that? What would you do? Indeed, these questions may become more relevant in the next 5-10 years from now in many of our countries, whether it be the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, anywhere in the West. You bet this is going to be the battle of the 21st century. In years past, in more impoverished countries, the government didn't really want their children. But in the rich socialist countries, in the brave new world, government agencies are excited about grabbing your children, reprogramming their minds by their own agendas. And as Christians, we are challenged to resist this. And that's, of course, the reason why the communists were arresting Christians in the 1950s out in Eastern Europe, because they were trying to evangelize the next generation. The reason the communists are arresting hundreds of Christians from the early reign church in China is largely because they are trying to educate their children in a Christian school there in China. Indeed, the Chinese Christians are willing to go to prison. They are fighting for their rights to educate their children according to the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. The battle has always been over the children. Don't kid yourself. The battle in communist Eastern Europe was over the children. The battle in communist China is over the children. The battle in modern-day Germany is over the children. The battle in the UK, in Canada, and America is over the children. Friends, that's where the battle is raging most ferociously today. And I guess my question for our audience today is, will you sign up for this battle? And that is the theme of a new book called Unshakeable, a story of unwavering faith and conviction by Elizabeth Wiens. She's from Canada, and she has written this book. Probably has a little bit of a prophetic flair to it. It is certainly on the topic that we have been discussing so far today. Elizabeth Wiens, the author of Unshakeable, a story of unwavering faith and conviction, now joins me on the Generations broadcast. Elizabeth, it's good to have you with us.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, and now you're a homeschool mom of how many? Is it 7?
Five children.
5 children, just like me. And you've been at this for a while.
Yeah, since 1996.
Okay. So you have taken full advantage of your freedoms to homeschool your kids just north of the border, we like to say, up in Canada. And so far, so good. You've had some freedoms to do that in Canada.
Right, yes. But we're seeing increasing restrictions on parental authority and on religious freedom here. So I think it calls us to be vigilant to protect those freedoms that we've gained from those who came prior to us that stood for those freedoms for us.
You know, it's interesting. I just have had several conversations with Christians in the UK. In fact, just yesterday, I had a Skype call with several important Christian leaders in the UK on this very topic. Indeed, they are in the battle for their lives over freedom for Christian schools and homeschooling. It seems that Christian schools right now are in the crosshairs. Is that what you're seeing there?
Definitely in Alberta, that's what we're seeing. Government passing legislation that's trying to force policies onto Christian schools that go against their religious faith. And right now that is before the courts here in Alberta. Some of the schools have said that they won't comply, and so they're challenging it on a constitutional freedom of religion basis and parental authority. So we're waiting to see how that is going to play out, but the government very much would like to dictate the belief systems and the values that are being presented within our Christian schools right now.
Now, Elizabeth, you just finished the book Unshakeable, a story of unwavering faith and conviction. This is a fictional story that could be nonfiction. And
right.
Yeah, speak to why you wrote this book.
Well, over the years, I've been really challenged and inspired by those who pioneered the modern-day homeschool movement. And when I heard stories of their courage and conviction to pull their children out of the public schools, even going against the compulsory education laws and when it wasn't popular, and that just really inspired me. And I believe that they did it because they trusted that God wanted them to provide a biblical education for their children. And so they were willing to face significant opposition from local authorities and even be taken to court to defend that freedom. And that's given us the basis for our freedom in education today. But I fear for the direction we're going in society and just the more and more restriction to our freedoms. And also just in seeing the shift within the home education community. And I sometimes wonder whether they would have that conviction to stand and fight that battle again if we were to face opposition and legislation that would restrict our freedom to homeschool today. I see many Christian families who are willing to forfeit their freedom to use biblically based resources in favor of using godless government programming. And whether that's out of fear, wondering whether they are going to meet the requirements or whether it's to gain government funding and accreditation, whatever's driving that, I see a real shift in our community, and they're not standing on the sense that they necessarily are trying to provide a biblical education using biblical resources. And so I wonder whether we're losing sight of what a biblical training and discipleship should be and are more concerned with getting man's approval instead of God's approval. So that's partly why I wrote this story, is just that whole thought process and wondering if we were to face that opposition again, how many families would be willing to stand on conviction to educate their children biblically. And so I was hoping to encourage and strengthen families in that stand and in God's truth. And I was also hoping that through my story that God would direct Christian parents whose children are in the public system to take a closer look at who's discipling their children and what that means, and look at Scripture and seek God's heart on the matter of education for their children as well.
You know, it's interesting. It seems that people fall asleep when the pressure is off. If there's no battle, if there is little persecuting force, when everything is calm and there is no pushback against what they're doing, it seems to me that people tend to fall asleep. When persecution rises, sometimes Christians do wake up and realize that this is a battle, and we are battling over the hearts and the souls of our children. And I'm not sure that parents realize that. Sometimes we step onto the enchanted ground, we fall asleep at the switch. And you think that's what's going on right now?
Very much so. I think that there is a complacency there, and they've lost sight of maybe why they started homeschooling to begin with, or why Christians fought for the right to homeschool to begin with. But I think they've also bought into the lie that education is neutral, and that it doesn't matter what resources they're using, or it doesn't matter whether their children are in the public system receiving a very ungodly education. And yet we see in Scripture in Matthew 12:30 where he says, "He who is not with me is against me. He who does not gather with me scatters abroad." There is no legitimate neutral education. It's either for God or against him, and it's either going to lead their children towards God or away from him. And we can see that happening with the number of young people we see leaving the faith. And I think in a large part it has to do with the fact that for many Christian parents, their children are in the public school system and their hearts are being discipled in an ungodly system.
Mm-hmm.
And we're causing our children to stumble, which Jesus very much warned against in Matthew when he warned against causing the little ones who believe in him to sin, and that it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depths of the sea. And I'm fearful for the next generation, and that's what we're causing by allowing them to be trained to think like the world and pursue ungodliness instead of staying the course and training them to think biblically and being able to grow up with an understanding of who God is and that he's relevant in their lives, and to have that strong Christian foundation.
Elizabeth, hopefully your book, Unshakeable, A Story of Unwavering Faith and Conviction, will be a wake-up call to this generation if they just read it and realize what is at stake. But give us a sense for the book. Give us a little synopsis of the book.
So basically, it's a fictional story, but based on the premise that we must obey God in the biblical training and discipleship of our children, even if man's law forbids it. So a takeoff of the Acts 5:29 of we ought to obey God rather than man. And so the story follows a group of homeschool families who are put in that position where the government passes a legislation that requires them to enroll their children in public school. And so it follows, starts with one of the fathers, Garrett Radke, who decides not to comply and tries to challenge some of the other families and parents. And they're forced to choose whether they want to follow God's direction and trust in his strength to endure, or whether to bow to the demands of the government system that's intent on molding the hearts and minds of their children. And so the story is a suspenseful journey that follows this extreme test of faith as they face the legal challenges and risk having their families torn apart for standing on their conviction. And that's really what it's all about. It's about Christian conviction and faithfulness in obeying God, and stresses the importance of guarding our freedom of religion and our God-given parental authority to train our children. But I'm hoping that that message is being presented in the context of a story that will also be very enjoyable for families as well.
You know, usually when persecutions break out, only a very, very small minority are willing to take the stand. Is that the way it works in the story? It's just rare to find somebody who's willing and has the faith and courage to make the stand.
Yes, it is. And often, I mean, unfortunately, even within the Christian community, there's a hesitancy to make that stand or to feel that they need to comply with the government, and so that's one of the arguments, one of the challenges within the story. But it comes down to, what do you believe is God's call for parents? Who did he give the authority to train children? Was it to parents or to the government? And if it's to parents, then we're going to be held responsible for that, regardless of whether we abdicate that authority to the government or not. And it comes down to, what is your conviction? And are you willing to stand for what is true and right and be obedient to what God calls you to, despite the opposition or the consequences? And that's a tough place to be in. And we've seen, I mean, that's what drew Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to face the fiery furnace. That's what led Daniel to face the lion's den, and the disciples to preach the gospel regardless if they were put in prison or if they lost their life. And so it comes down to conviction, and what more important calling do we have as Christian parents than to be discipling our children in the things of God, and to be obedient in how we're discipling them.
Mm-hmm. Elizabeth, I don't want to give the story away, but if we refuse to submit our children to the state schools and to the homosexual indoctrination programs, and we homeschool them, and we break the law, say in this scenario, we take the risk of losing them to the social services. Is that a risk we should take?
That's a very tough position to be in, and I hope I never have to face that.
Right.
Ultimately, I believe some of the early homeschoolers in the 70s or 80s were, in a sense, risking that. They were being taken to court for truancy and had social services sometimes knocking on their doors. So it is a very tough position to be in, but ultimately, it comes down to, am I going to be obedient to God despite the consequences, or am I going to give in? And if I give in, who's going to be discipling them then? And we've lost that privilege of being able to disciple them the way God has called us to. And you don't have to look very far in the public school systems today to see what that's going to look like and how many children we are losing to that system. So, yeah, it's definitely a theme that comes up in my book that is going to be challenging for many, but sometimes we have to be willing to be obedient even when we don't know what the outcome is going to be, and trust God to do what's best for our family.
Did you play around with the idea of fleeing the country in the book? And of course, I know that once families are caught up in the bureaucratic net, it's almost impossible to make it out of the country. But did you play with that as a possibility for some of the families?
I did, but I see we already have some countries in the world where homeschooling is illegal and families are being persecuted. And we see a lot of pressure internationally through UNESCO and some of those organizations. And ultimately, I think we see in a lot of countries that push against religious freedom. And so I wanted to paint a picture of, if you didn't have any other options, would you stand or not? It's always easier when you can have an option to flee or to avoid the conflict. But if you are faced in the middle of the conflict, would you stand? And that's where I felt it really comes down to the true measure of where that conviction is and where that faith is if you're willing to stand regardless.
Well, for 30 years at least, it seems that homeschooling freedoms have been plentiful in your country, my country, quite a number of other countries around the world. But you think the trajectory now is going into a different direction? Take Alberta, for example.
We've definitely seen a shift within Alberta in recent years, but there's certainly a louder and louder voice calling for a one system, having all the children in the public school. Where that goes, it's hard to say, but if we're complacent and we're not speaking up now, it's a whole lot easier for that shift to come in, and then the battle becomes a lot harder. So I guess I'm hoping to stir people's attention and help them to catch a vision to why it's important now to be conscious of where we're going. So
the sooner everybody wakes up, the better. Elizabeth Wiens is the author of Unshakeable, a story of unwavering faith and conviction. Elizabeth, how can folks get a hold of this resource?
Currently, it's on Amazon.com and Amazon.ca, as well as our family online bookstore here in Canada, Merchant Ship. We're still working on distribution and that, but it is available on Amazon.
Very good. Unshakeable, A Story of Unwavering Faith and Conviction by Elizabeth Wiens, available at Amazon.com, friends. Elizabeth, thanks for joining us on Generations. We pray God's blessings on your work, and we appreciate every little effort out there to continue to defend our precious freedoms for our children and our grandchildren.
Thank you very much.
This is Kevin Swanson, inviting you back again next time as we continue to lay down a vision for the next generation.